Somewhere out there, a young nurse was running. A quiet country road, a hot afternoon, nothing unusual, no reason to be afraid. By nightfall, she was gone. What followed was the kind of search that breaks a town open. Hundreds of people, flashlights cutting through fields, voices going hoarse, and walking right beside them, grief painted carefully across his face, was the man who had already done the unthinkable. He didn't just watch the search unfold. He joined it. He comforted. He coordinated. He looked people in the eye. The monster wasn't hiding in the dark. He was standing in the light, pretending to help find the woman he had just murdered. Sydney Sutherland was the kind of person who seemed to bring energy wherever she went. Friends described her as warm, lively, and impossible to ignore in the best way. She worked as a nurse, dedicating long shifts to caring for patients who trusted her with their lives. Outside the hospital, she was just as devoted to the people around her. Family meant everything to her, especially her two young nieces who adored their aunt. Sydney had the kind of personality that made people feel comfortable instantly, the kind that made strangers feel like friends. In a small rural community where everyone knew each other, she was a familiar face, someone people expected to see smiling, laughing, and moving through life with the confidence of someone who believed the world was mostly good. Running was part of her routine. After long shifts at the hospital, it helped her clear her mind and release the stress of the day. The quiet roads outside town were peaceful, stretching through farmland and open fields. She had taken that route countless times before, jogging past gravel roads and wide fields where nothing ever seemed to happen. It was the kind of place where danger felt distant, almost impossible. The road Sydney chose that afternoon was familiar, predictable, safe. At least, that's what everyone believed. On the afternoon of August 19th, 2020, Sydney left for her usual run. A camera near her home captured her walking down the driveway in athletic clothes, heading toward the same rural road she had traveled many times before. Nothing about that moment seemed unusual. There were no signs of danger, no warnings of what was about to unfold. Minutes passed, then hours. Eventually, the people closest to her realized something was wrong. Sydney was always reliable. She answered calls. She checked in. But now her phone was silent, and she hadn't returned home. Concern quickly turned into alarm. Family members reached out to friends and neighbors. Soon the local sheriff's office was notified, and the search began almost immediately. In many missing person cases, authorities hesitate, wondering if someone simply chose to leave for a while. But this time was different. Everyone who knew Sydney understood that disappearing without explanation was not something she would ever do. Within hours, volunteers gathered to help search the surrounding area. The response from the community was overwhelming. People arrived with four-wheelers, horses, and search dogs. Helicopters circled overhead while volunteers combed through miles of farmland and rural roads. It felt like the entire region had come together with one goal: find Sydney. Social media groups formed overnight, sharing updates and organizing search teams. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers joined the effort. And among those volunteers was a local farmer named Quake Llewellyn. At first, there was nothing unusual about his presence. In a tight-knit rural community, helping search for a missing neighbor was simply what people did. Witnesses later remembered seeing him several times during the search, moving through the same fields and roads as everyone else. He appeared calm, cooperative, even sympathetic. At one point, he approached Sydney's mother and offered her comfort, wrapping his arms around her in a hug and reassuring her that they would find her daughter. But the truth was far darker. Quake Llewellyn wasn't searching for Sydney. He already knew exactly where she was. 2 days after the search began, investigators made a devastating discovery. In a remote area of farmland not far from where Sydney had been running, they found a freshly disturbed patch of earth. Beneath the soil was the body everyone had been desperately hoping to find alive. The medical examiner later confirmed what investigators feared most. Sydney had been killed by multiple blunt force injuries. What began as a missing person case had become a homicide investigation. Shock rippled through the community as authorities quickly identified a suspect. Within hours of the discovery, Quake Llewellyn was arrested and charged with capital murder, rape, kidnapping, and abuse of a corpse. For many people, the news felt impossible to process. This was someone who had stood beside them during the search. Someone who had looked into the eyes of Sydney's grieving family and pretended to share their hope. Investigators began piecing together what had happened that afternoon. According to evidence later presented in court, Llewellyn had been driving along a gravel road when he saw Sydney jogging alone. Instead of continuing on his way, he turned his truck around and returned to where she was running. What happened next unfolded quickly and violently. He forced her into his vehicle and drove to a remote area miles away from the road where she had been seen. There, the attack became even more brutal. Prosecutors said he assaulted her, then killed her, before burying her body in a shallow grave on farmland. After committing the crime, he did something that left investigators stunned. He simply returned to his normal routine. He checked on farm equipment, finished his work for the day, and went home as if nothing had happened. That night, when people began asking if anyone had seen Sydney, he calmly told them he had passed her earlier during her run. The next day, when the search intensified, he joined the volunteers. He walked the same roads where people were desperately hoping to find her alive. He participated in the effort, speaking with investigators and neighbors alike. To anyone watching, he looked like just another concerned member of the community. But technology would eventually expose the truth. During the investigation, authorities examined data from multiple sources, including phones, apps, and digital tracking tools. Location data from Llewellyn's phone placed him extremely close to the exact location where Sydney's body was later discovered. Combined with additional evidence and interviews, investigators confronted him with the growing case against him. Eventually, he confessed to abducting and killing her. The evidence investigators collected was overwhelming. Clothing linked to the crime was recovered. Digital records tracked his movements. Physical evidence tied him to the burial site. As the case moved through the legal system, prosecutors prepared to pursue the most severe punishment possible. The community followed every development closely, still struggling to understand how something so horrific could happen in a place that had always felt safe. More than a year later, the case reached its conclusion in a packed courtroom filled with people wearing pink in Sydney's honor. Instead of facing a lengthy trial, Quake Llewellyn chose to plead guilty to capital murder and rape. By doing so, he avoided the death penalty but received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The man who had once walked freely among the searchers would spend the rest of his life behind prison walls. For Sydney's family, the sentence brought a form of justice, but not closure. In emotional statements delivered in court, they spoke about the devastating loss that could never be repaired. Her mother described the moment that haunted her most, realizing that the same man who had taken her daughter's life had hugged her during the search, pretending to share her grief. Today, Sydney Sutherland is remembered not only for the tragedy that ended her life, but for the kindness and energy she brought to the people around her. A memorial scholarship was created in her name to support students pursuing careers in healthcare, continuing the legacy of compassion she showed every day as a nurse. but the case still leaves behind questions that may never be answered. Why did someone who knew her choose to commit such a horrific act? Why return to the search and stand beside the very people mourning her disappearance? Those questions remain part of the unsettling mystery surrounding one of the most disturbing crimes many people had never heard about. What remains undeniable is this: Sydney left home for a simple run on a quiet road she trusted. She expected to return, just like she had every time before. Instead, her life was taken in an act of violence that shocked an entire community. Her story is a reminder that even in places that seem peaceful, darkness can hide where no one expects it.